What's up, guys? This is TheKephas. Today I'm going to show you some macros that I've created with Gnome Sequencer Enhanced, an extremely powerful add-on that allows you to create robust macros that can perform most, if not all, of your rotation with a single button. This can be extremely useful if you have a disability like myself, or if you just want to be lazy. Bear in mind that these macros can be extremely helpful, but they also have their limits, so they're made primarily for those who are playing the game at a more casual level. But feel free to use them as you see fit. If you'd like to learn more about Gnome Sequencer and how to use it, I recommend that you head over to WoW Lazy Macros. You can find links to all of that, and to import strings for these macros in the description. Today we're going to check out the macro that I've created for Blood Death Knights. Now, Blood Death Knights are tanks, and I have not necessarily been able to fully test this in a tank setting, so I want to make sure that's clear. Most of my testing has either been on the dummy or out in the world, just kind of messing around. But just remember that, I'm doing every class and spec here, and there's only so much I can really do in terms of testing. So if you're someone that's like looking to use this in mythic dungeons, I wouldn't recommend that anyways, but just know that this has not been fully tested, and Blood Death Knights are a little bit trickier to macro, and it's not because the rotation is particularly hard, it's just the manner that you need to be using your abilities. So we'll go over it and you'll see what I mean as we talk about it, but at the very least, if you're out in the world messing around, maybe doing dailies or something simpler, this macro would probably make things easier for you. So we'll go over the build first. Let's open up the talent tree here and you'll see my build. So for the most part, it's pretty straightforward stuff. Some of the key abilities that you're going to want on the Death Knight side are the Death and Decay enhancing abilities. So like this one, which makes Heart Strike hit multiple enemies when you're inside your Death and Decay. On top of that is Grip of the Dead. It was really hard not to go with Death's Reach. I love this talent, but Grip of the Dead is really good at enhancing your Death and Decay, which is a very important ability for Blood Death Knights. So I went ahead and went with this one, though. For solo play, I might consider switching over to a Death's Reach just for having more death grips, as I'm just running around killing enemies out in the world. But yeah, so that's certainly an option that you can go with. So the talent that I'm not 100% sure about is Death's Echo, and we'll talk about that. Cancel. I have an Alexa, and the wake word is that one. So sorry. So this ability makes it so that you have 2 deaths advances, 2 death grips, and also 2 death and decays. And so the reason why I'm not sure about this one is the way Death and Decay works in the macro is it's going to use it whenever it's available. So it's going to be spamming through all the abilities. It's going to use Death and Decay, and it's going to be using both stacks before the first Death and Decay is up. And so the reason why I'm wondering about this is I don't know if you say you put Death and Decay down twice, if that stacks. I don't know how that works. So if it doesn't stack, then this would be a waste in the macro. If you are someone who knows whether or not this stacks, please let me know in the comments below. What I recommend you do is if it doesn't stack, then this talent is useless if you're using the macro. So what you can do is you can take this talent away, just click off of this one, and you could take another talent. Like you could go with the 3% leech. It's an easy one. It's really straightforward. I don't know if that's good leech or not. Probably not that good, but it's an option. And you could also go with like this one, which reduces the cooldown of Icebound Fortitude, giving you more of a defensive cooldown more often. So that's something you could go with as well. Or you could go with any number of these other talents that I didn't go with. Okay, so down at the bottom, I kind of went with the easy ones. Empower Rune Weapons, really good. And then, of course, Abomination's Limb is very easy to use. I never go with Soul Reaper. It's just too complicated, too complex for the macro, so I just don't go with that one. Okay, so on the right side, the blood side, Again, I've gone with a very straightforward build. Okay, the idea behind my build is to keep things as simple as possible, make things easier for the macro to work and function better. Most of the talents are talents that complement each other, abilities that help other abilities do better. So some abilities will enhance the damage of other abilities, some abilities will reduce the cooldown of other abilities, different things like that, much how the death and decay works, how that enhances heart strike. So, you know, giving you a little bit extra healing, you know, different things like that. So a couple of the ones I want to kind of highlight, of course, are this one's here, Death's Caress. I haven't added too many extra abilities. I consider this an extra, where these are kind of your staples. You know, Death's Caress is kind of an extra, but it's a really good ability with a fairly short, really short cooldown. It does use a rune, but it's going to apply Blood Plague. It's also going to give you a couple stacks of Bone Shield, so that's going to help out as well. So I did go with that one, but I did not take either one of these. This here, Blood Drinker, is a channeled ability. That's not going to be great in the macro. And then, of course, there's this one, Consumption. I've used this in past expansions. It's a cool ability. Frankly, it has too long of a cooldown, so I just didn't feel like it was worth it. Adding that longer cooldown in the macro just didn't seem worth it to me. So chose not to go with that one. Now, as we get down here into the bottom, there's really only one, well, there's a couple things I want to go over, really. Again, just trying to go with the simpler options. You know, Purgatory is good for survivability, and then just some other passives as well. Now, this is a good talent for vampiric blood. This will reduce the cooldown of vampiric blood so that you can use it more often. But for me, I don't get as much of a benefit from it. I mean, I still would get a benefit from it even as a solo player, but I felt like it was just easier, and it may not even be better, but I just chose to go with Leeching Strike instead. So this just gives my Heart Strike like healing ability. So like every time Heart Strike does damage, it gives me a little bit of health back. It's more passive. It's a little bit simpler. I don't have to worry about, you know, keeping track of vampiric blood as much. So I chose that one. But if you want to benefit more from vampiric blood, then you could just take Leeching Strike out and then just add vampiric blood. You could totally do that if you want to. Now, another one that's maybe not the most ideal decision that I've made is I went for Mark of Blood in favor of Tombstone. And the reason why I did that is Mark of Blood works better in the macro. It has a really short cooldown, so that does present a little bit of a challenge, but I found a way to make that work. This doesn't cost anything, and it's just an easy, you know, ability to throw up there every now and then. Tombstone is a great ability. The problem is that, like, trying to put this in the macro, there's no way to guarantee that you're going to have the amount of runes, or not runes, the amount of blood, bone shield charges that you need in order to get the most benefit from this. So Tombstone's going to be used whenever it's available, no matter how many bone shield charges you have. So that makes it really hard to macro, and that's why I chose not to go with it, even though it probably is the better ability. But I chose to go with Mark of Blood instead. Easier to use. You're going to get some benefits from it. And then, you know, I just had to go with Shattering Bone. It's just too good not to go with. So that's why I had to pick one or the other. I just chose to go with the easier one. So, you know, feel free to switch over to Tombstone. You could use it on a separate button if you want to. That's entirely an option. But that's kind of why I just chose to go with the easier option. And we'll go over how this works in the macro actually right now. So that's pretty much everything you need to know about how my build works, you know. So just remember, I always go for the most simple build for the macro. People often comment on my builds like, you know, this is the better build, but you know, if you're coming into these videos trying to min-max, then you already are misunderstanding the purpose of these videos. So don't do that, okay? I'm just going to ignore you. So just, I go for builds that work better with the macro. That's something that everybody needs to understand, okay? So with all that being said, let's go ahead and open up GSE so we can take a look at the macro. This is called Kef Blood. It's a all-in-one macro for Blood Death Knights. If you want to use my build, you can just copy this up here and import this into the talent tree and you'll be good to go. With that being said, let's take a look at the build itself. Okay, so this is the macro, not the build. We're taking a look at the macro itself. So the first thing outside of the sequence, we have Mark of Blood. The idea here is that occasionally you're going to try to use Mark of Blood, so that way you're not using it more than you really should have to. But the macro is going to try to use it on cooldown occasionally. There's no guarantee that you're going to use it right away, just with how these macros work, because you're going to be cycling through the abilities. But you're going to try to use this occasionally, and then you're going to be cycling through the sequence 3 times before you try to use this again. But if your GCD is activated when you pass by this, it won't use it. So there might be times where this ability would be available, but it's not being used. The macro should eventually use it pretty well. Okay, so I just want to make sure that you understand that. With that being said, let's go ahead and look at the rest of this. So we get down into the sequence. This is a standard sequence macro. We don't use priority lists just because there are too many abilities and they would bog down the macros. So starting off, we have your rune spender. Okay, so first you have Marrow Rend, and Heart Strike. So when you're holding down Shift, the macro will use Marrow Rend. If you're not holding down anything, the macro will use Heart Strike. So this is where one of the challenges comes in, because you want to make sure that you're keeping up with your bone shields through Marrow Rend. Okay, but the good news is, from my experience testing this, when I'm not holding down Shift, I am using Heart Strike occasionally, but I tend to generate more runes than I spend just with using this macro. I don't know if that's ideal or not, but it makes it pretty easy to at least have some runes available to use Marrow Rend, so that's good. But again, I haven't fully tested this, so this could be a challenge. But regardless, you just hold down Shift, and that's how you use Marrow Rend. Otherwise, you can use Heart Strike. If you don't like that and say you might want to manage these abilities on separate buttons, then you could just remove this whole block from the macro entirely and then use Marrow Rend and Heart Strike on separate buttons. So just exit here, it'll get rid of it. The macro will do everything else, and then you manage your runes separately. For the most part, there are a couple of other rune spinners in here. We'll get to those in a second, but that's generally the challenge. The biggest challenge with this macro is how it uses Marrow Rend and Heart Strike and trying to keep up your bone shields. So that's the biggest thing, making sure that you always have enough runes. Okay, so moving on, we have Dancing Rune Weapon. The macro is just going to use this on cooldown. Following that up with Death and Decay. Now I've added an @player command here. So what this will do is, Death and Decay is a target location ability, so it's the green reticle on the ground. This macro will eliminate that entirely and just put this ability at your feet. You need to be standing in it anyways. The challenge here, of course, is that you want to make sure that you're standing in the right spot when you start spamming away at this macro, so that way you're putting Death and Decay where you're standing. And then the idea is enemies will be coming to you. You are a melee character after all. You can pull enemies in, and this ability you'll get a lot of benefit out of it, and you won't have to worry about it. So that's how Death and Decay works, and this is why having 2 stacks of Death and Decay could be a problem. If they don't stack on the ground, then that's why that talent might not be great, just because Death and Decay is just going to be used all the time. So something to keep in mind. We also, I didn't mention it, there is also a talent we've chosen that can reset the cooldown of Death and Decay, so you should be getting it fairly often. But yeah, just something to keep in mind. Next up, we have Death's Caress. The macro is going to use that on cooldown. On Abomination's Limb, same thing. Then we have Death Strike for your runic power, giving you some extra healing and spending your runic power. Now, again, there might be situations where you want to pull a little bit of your runic power if you have maxed health. The macro is not going to do that. It's just going to use the ability as it gets to it and you have enough runic power to use it. So again, this is one of those challenges with using a macro like this. When you get into a point where the macro is not able to manage your runes or your runic power, then you really don't need to be using a macro. But for casual players, it should be fine. You should be generating enough. You'll get some healing here and there, and the macro is just going to use the abilities. But that's stuff that you need to think about when you try to use macros like these. There's really no way to make it work that make it worthwhile to even have a macro if you're going to have to, if you want to use your brain more and have more discretion over your abilities, then you really shouldn't be using macros much at all. Okay, that's the big thing to take away from this. Okay, so then last up is Blood Boil. The macro is just going to be using that one on cooldown, or as it becomes available. Okay, so we get down in here into key press and key release. Your standard stuff, targeting, and then of course start attack because you are a melee character. And then under key release, we put a lot of our off global cooldown abilities. We have Empower Rune Weapon. may not be the most ideal to put in here, but it just makes it simpler. So if you want to have more control over your Empower Rune weapon, just remove it from the macro. That would apply to all these. The macro is going to use Raise Dead on cooldown, and of course it's going to use Anti-Magic Shell on cooldown. I like to include that one because the cooldown's fairly short, gives you an extra bit of protection, defense, and you already have like 3 other defensive cooldowns anyways, so I figured it was just beneficial to just, passively use this one. But again, if you don't want to use these abilities passively, you don't want to use them on cooldown, you want to have more control over them, as it would apply to any ability, just remove them from the macro. But that's pretty much everything you need to know about how this macro works. It's pretty standard. It's going to be using all of your abilities on cooldown. It's going to be spending your runic power on Death Strike. The big thing to remember is that because of how these macros work, trying to cycle through all the abilities, there are going to be times where you would probably want to use another ability and the macro doesn't use that ability as quickly as you would like. That is just the nature of using Gnome Sequencer, and that's something that you should probably understand. Is you're taking away a lot of the control over the class, and having more of a human input. This is not a bot. This is a simplification. It's a sequence macro. It's just trying to simplify things. It's not ideal for min-maxing and for cutting edge gameplay. It's ideal for people that might have a disability and want to try out the class, or for people that are genuinely just trying to play the game casually and are being lazy. So keep all that in mind. Otherwise, the macro is going to cover pretty much everything. Just remember your modifier for Bone Shield, and let me know what you think about this macro in the comments below. I did try my best, and again, I'm trying to provide as much understanding as possible. So yeah, let me know what you think about it in the comments below. With that being said, I will see you guys on the next one.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And if you'd like to see more videos, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook, and if you'd like, you can support my work on Patreon. Links to all that stuff can be found in the description below. This is TheKephas. Until next time.